Hello, beloved listeners. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby. And I'm your host, Liv, here with another special episode in honor of Pride Month. Today's episode is another selection of favorite LGBTQIA moments from past episodes, but focusing on some of the incredible conversations that I have been lucky enough to have had over the years. From the history and brilliance behind the ancient Greek poetess from Lesbos, modern Lesvos, the woman who gave us the word lesbian, and my most viral tweet, Sappho, to theories of asexuality in Atalanta and Hippolytus, to the incredible non-binary reading of the Bacchae, featuring both Dionysus and Pentheus as non-binary icons, to queer theory and beyond. I am so lucky to have had such incredible guests and conversations on my show. I'm so grateful to everyone who ever wants to come on and talk about these things. I think conversations about these topics and the ancient people and characters who fit under today's LGBTQIA umbrella really serve to highlight the just universality of these people and really emphasize how much none of this is new and how important it is to remember that. Just like Tuesday's episode, today's clips were selected by the two wonderful women who are helping me out with this, Michaela and my new intern, Grace Roby, who was so keen to help me out with all of this. And again, the episode's audio was put together by the incredible Michaela Smith, who does so many wonderful things for me and this podcast. Honestly, what a queen. Huge thanks to both of them for all of their hard work. And, well, I've spoken to so many incredible people about so many incredible things, so this episode is going to be long enough without me rambling on to you now. This is the Pride Special episode. Call them queer. Conversations of queerness, asexuality, non-binary gods, and so much more.
And I said that there aren't very many people working on stuff like this. One of the very few that I've read is Chris Mowat. I think they're at Sheffield. Has a book that just came out about gender in the ancient world. And
thrilling.
Yes.
Sorry.
And I haven't gotten a chance to read it yet, but I've read, snippets, and I know they've done some presentations on the subject. And, what you see there is this sort of consistent need to push back on we can't use those labels. Well, how can you use the label heterosexual for them? Like, that just wouldn't apply either. You have to be able to simultaneously hold in your head that the terminology and the categories we use are not the ones they would have used, and that everything we label now existed then, and everything that existed then exists now. People, I love to say this, people do not change. Humanity does not fundamentally change. We have the same broad spectrum of variations. We have the same, general tendencies as a mass. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, a lot of people will be like, oh my God, are you saying we can never move past where No. What I'm saying is that people have always had the ability to understand the things that we understand now, and the ability to understand the things they understood then that we don't. We are capable of putting ourselves in those shoes. And just because the way we think, the categories in our language may be different, that doesn't mean that they don't apply somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, there were definitely spaces for people to be asexual, for women to say, no, I don't want marriage. And, we don't have the evidence to know whether that was because they were ace, because they just hated the patriarchy that much, because, boy, I understand that.
That's where I'm at. That's me as a person. I would be back there like, not quite ace, not ace necessarily, but also just like, no, like this
like,
is
no
not going to be
thanks,
my
I'm going to
life.
devote myself to being a Vestal Virgin because fuck you. That's
Yeah,
why.
exactly. Yeah.
Like, sure, we don't know their internal motivations, but I'm going to tell you that those people existed, and these spaces allowed them to exist as themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is just the coolest thing that we can learn from people like Atalanta and Hippolytus.
And it's really interesting because his mother becomes such an important part of his mythology. Like Semele really is a defining feature of what will then become Dionysus's life, because like he, as you're saying, she's mortal. He should really, if we're thinking about it, surely he would have been like a demigod, like one of these heroes like Heracles, but he undergoes a series of this thing where he goes into the underworld. He basically has to prove himself to like become a god in some of the myths. And even when he goes down to the underworld, he goes looking for his mother. And so you get this idea that he had a far closer relationship with his mother than you see in other male Greek gods, and really just other men in general. The only kind of other explanation, the only other like similarity I can think of is with Aphrodite and Eros. But even then, like Eros is a baby, like is this permanent child. So that's very different from this adult who is often celebrated in the same context of his mother, or celebrated with Demeter, who's also really celebrated for being a mother. There is this maternal association with Dionysus that is so unusual, but is just really, really interesting. I think there could be a lot of interesting research to do in that area, because you really don't see that kind of mother-child worship together in cults very often, unless it's like Demeter and Kore, or Persephone,
Mm-hmm.
or then Dionysus and his mother. So
Well,
yeah.
that's so true. And then you add to that and I don't know how widespread these are across all the various sources we have, but the idea that Semele died right away
Hmm.
and that he was
Yeah.
born from Zeus's thigh. So it's like that's a fascinating relationship to have, also given the fact that essentially she did not live for any of his
Yeah.
life.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that, even just that narrative of birth kind of cements the idea that Dionysus has been complicating gender and ideas of gender and sex ever since he existed. Like, you have this thing where the myths specifically refer to it as Zeus grows a womb in his thigh, and he puts Dionysus into his own womb. And so it's made very clear that this, like, the kind of hyper masculine, fuckboy of the gods, grows his own, is basically given a womb, which, to the ancient Greeks was like the defining feature of a woman, because that was
It's all we're good for. Yeah.
exactly all women were just a walking womb, just waiting. um yeah, so you get this like kind of gender deviancy that happens just like in that moment before his birth. But then also, some of the sources say that then because he had to be hidden from Zeus's wife, because
Zeus.
if Hera found out he'd had another affair, it wouldn't have gone well. And the best way to hide him away was thought to be, oh, let's raise him as a girl. So then you get this kind of other, which is like a big motif, obviously, in folklore across the world, this idea that someone is being raised as a gender that they are not, and the kind of repercussions that has. But I think it's really interesting that you get this idea that a god, a male, supposedly a male god, spent the first portion of his life as a woman.
Because it is a play about performance and identity and saying that you are something and then making it so.
Mm-hmm.
Which is it gets really, really interesting when you kind of fold that into thinking about gender as performative. And that gets really hairy when you apply it to what happens with Pentheus.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that Pentheus's experience of gender is staged. Not necessarily how it is in the Greek, not necessarily how Euripides would have meant it to be, but in the way that it is staged and discussed. Because for audience context, Pentheus is encouraged by Dionysus to dress as a woman, to go up and spy on the Maenads, and he is, discovered at the top of a tree, and the tree is uprooted, and he is horribly torn apart by his mother and aunts. But he does so dressed as a woman. Not just a woman, specifically a Maenad. He is specifically dressed as one of Dionysus's own followers, and the way that he is coerced into doing this is more often than not on stage played for comedy. And is played as it, and plays off of the tropes in modern media that a man in a dress is automatically funny. Which no.
Yeah, problematic as hell.
Problematic as hell. And again, like my first experiences of this play in college, 19, I never found those scenes funny. Not because I was consciously thinking about the very like complicated gender dynamics going on in there, but because it was so sad.
It's not written funny.
No, it's really kind of it's sad and it's scary.
Yeah, it's so deceptive. It's so like, it's not at all written funny.
No, and you can see Pentheus kind of fighting it at some turns, and like I'm of the opinion that there's a little bit of Jedi mind trickery going on, that Dionysus is maybe kind of taking a desire that's already there and turning it up to 11.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
Or taking an inhibition that's there and turning it down. I don't think he's putting ideas in Pentheus's head that aren't there. I don't think he's putting desires in Pentheus that aren't there. But it is so, so sad and scary to watch somebody kind of understanding that their autonomy is being violated and then succumb to it, and then go through this experience that maybe in an alternate reality could have been something that was like good and healing and opening up something in Pentheus. And if this is something that would have been helpful for him, or maybe this is something that he wants, if this is something that he genuinely wants, if having any kind of experience of femininity, I don't put any kind of label on it. I do not think that I think that it is up to the translator and up to the choice of the individual production to, if they want to put a name to it, put a name to it. Pentheus is having some kind of experience of femininity and of non-normative gender and is enjoying it. And that could be something that is a positive experience, and particularly a positive experience is being gifted to them by the god of that.
Which exists a lot in mythology, right? Like that's the story I always go back to, is this idea that a lot of characters that we can see now as trans were gifted with their true gender by the gods. They were transformed. And so often it is, it is a gift or a punishment, but I mean, still you can it still is a transformation by the gods that, and so that is so interesting. And then, to also look at it as we can gather that at some point Dionysus went through a similar experience and found that comforting and nice to be, expressing themselves in that way. And then so to do it almost forcefully to Pentheus sort of adds another layer onto that as well.
Yeah, and it on stage, it is, and I rarely see it staged this way because I understand why you wouldn't, because you want Pentheus's outfit to have some kind of impact. And if you're playing it for comedy, which you shouldn't, you have to make like a very distinct sartorial choice. But if we go with what is in the play, the way that what Dionysus describes himself as wearing at the top of the play and what Pentheus puts on are the same outfit. They are achieving a level of, they are coming towards each other in this way that could be so interesting and so cool and so helpful. And this is happening while Pentheus is having hallucinations and or elements of religious kind of ecstatic experience. He comes back out dressed as the Maenad, and he is seeing double. He sees 2 suns in the sky, 2 sets of 7 gates around the city of Thebes, and those are things that are and are not real, or he's kind of getting a glimpse behind the veil, or he's getting some kind of heightened or altered state of consciousness. And then he looks at Dionysus, and he sees bull horns from Dionysus's head, and the bull is a sacred symbol of Dionysus, and Dionysus in Bacchae in particular is very often conflated with the bull, is called a bull when he is leading Pentheus to his death, and Pentheus sees the bull. And it's very hard for me to view this act, this costume change, as something that is just purely deceptive and purely cruel and purely meant to be shameful and humiliating, when it is accompanied by some kind of divine and magical and holy glimpse of truth. It's this very weird combination of elements of like, yes, he's about to die. Yes, this is not for his benefit, but he does get this one little moment of seeing something that both is and is not there, and seeing something that is not real and yet more than real, while he himself is experiencing in his own body something that is not real and more than real. In that, like, my body and the way that I choose to have my body look in the world are different right now and feel different, and I feel different in them. And he has, he is adjusting the way that he stands. He says, I want to look like my mother right now. Is this how my Aunt Ino stands? I want to get it right. Tell me what to do. Tell me how to exist in this new version of myself, which is for me personally, as a person as a queer person, as a non-binary person, holy shit. And it's so sad. It is so sad that something that could be so good is used for such violence. And particularly a queer person inflicting violence through queerness onto another person who could potentially also be queer. And how absolutely heartbreaking that is.
A lot of the other gods, we do have evidence that they had relationships and affairs with men, but rather than the idea of kind of gay or straight in the ancient world, a lot of it was like basically who's the top and who's the bottom, like this penetrator versus penetrated. And Dionysus is really rare in all of the sexual encounters with men we know about. He's always the one that gets penetrated, which is like a completely like crazily abnormal thing coming from a
Yeah.
Greek god. But he always kind of takes this kind of what would have been viewed as the women's role, like the effeminate role. And even going back to when you were talking about Ariadne, we have one of my favorite reports of how people like worshipped Dionysus, where Xenophon is telling us about this tradition in Athens of like recreating the marriage between Dionysus and Ariadne. And it's like this really beautiful thing, but Xenophon makes clear that Ariadne gets seated on this throne and then Dionysus comes in and sits on her lap. And so even there you have this idea that, you know, she's wearing the pants in the relationship.
Yes.
Dionysus definitely isn't taking the normal male role, even when he's in a relationship that, you know, people might assume to be a kind of, you know, coming from a queer theory lens, that's the expected, the normal relationship. And he still completely kind of turns it on his head.
One of my favorite ones was when we talked to Diane Rayer, who we've mentioned a million times because she's one of the best Sappho translators out there. But we talked to her about
I'm ordering her books right now.
Yes.
So good. And she's also just so passionate about Sappho. When you talk to her, I almost cried when we talked to her because she was so eloquent about the impact that Sappho had on her and her life's work. It was really beautiful. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was one of the fragments, which Elise sort of alluded to earlier. There is one word that's a gerund in it. And so some people, pretty much before Diane, have translated that phrase as for love of a boy, because the word means, it just means child in Greek. It just means like a young person. But there was a gerund that she found that had a feminine connotation. And so she used the feminine gerund to turn it into for love for a girl. And I just thought it was so interesting that that one word can change everything, and just how important the translation is from bringing, obviously, fragments to somebody who can actually translate Greece, and then taking that translation. And so how much Sappho has, we know, has changed over time because of how people translate her, but also how, like, if you do translate her correctly, it's super gay and I love it. That's all.
Well, but that's the thing about everything from ancient Greece is that translations are so subjective. They're so subjective, and it just depends kind of on the thoughts and feelings of the person translating it. Like, I know there's a lot of instances of old translations of Homer where the women are often depicted as, like, the word is that's translated into English as like slut or something of the like, but really it was just like some variation on the word for woman. Like, it was, yeah. So
God.
it's just like this sort of it's just insane prejudice and misogyny, and then we're like, we learn this the whole time. Or even, I mean, I'm constantly referring to however many different translations I can find of something, because my biggest thing in the podcast is understanding consent, or typically complete lack thereof, in Greek mythology. But because everything we have was written down by men, they wouldn't necessarily actually phrase it like the way that it was believed, or the way that it was believed by the women in the world. And often it's like, you can just assume for the most part that when it comes to the gods, like, there was no consent, but the men writing the story didn't care, so they didn't write it down like that. Or if they did and it was, you know, subtle, and then it wasn't translated as such. And there's so many different ways you can understand something, and I tend to try to find translations by women whenever I can, because it makes a world of difference.
But yeah, it just like is so fascinating to me because obviously it's like this ancient game of telephone, and we're getting the final answer through the lens of so many different people, and like you said, also a lot of men. And so it's really been interesting to get as many perspectives as we can from women as well.
Yeah, and like we've learned a lot about it's very disappointing, right, that we only have 600 fragments left out of 10,000 lines of poetry, but at the same time, it's miraculous that we have even that. It's miraculous that we have even that because I mean, it's 2 millennia old, so it's like, massively old, and it's been found in the desert and in trash heaps, but also like the only reason that it would have survived long enough to even be written down the way it was that people really loved it, even though at the time lyric poetry was kind of not really the thing. It wasn't as great as epic poetry. People weren't really as into it as epic poetry. And women poets, I mean, it was like a woman writing was like a dog walking on its back legs. Like it was just insane. So if you were like, if you were like a teacher in classical Greece or in Rome, you wouldn't teach a woman poet, and like you wouldn't do that because and she was pagan, right? So once Christianity started spreading, her work is getting burned, like, and so the reason her work's getting burned, right, at like in like the medieval times when Christianity is spreading, is not so much that it's sexual, because like we know that like like Gregory VII didn't burn the pornographic poems of Martial. So it wasn't that there was sex in it. It's that it was women writing, and that it was women writing about loving other women. And erotic poetry is far more threatening to the order. It's far more radical than pornographic poetry, because erotic poets are singing about the soul, and they're singing about the reverence of the self and the other, and the reverence of desire and hope and joy, and all these things are much more transcendent than just like sex and like pornographic descriptions like you'd have in Martial or even Catullus. So I think that's really interesting to like keep reading about how important and radical her work is, and was and has been, and how it's so miraculous that it survived even in the form that we have today.
Yeah, I mean, everything that we have it's so interesting how it survived. It's always such a saga for how much work it took for something to survive to where we have it now. Because so much, I mean, between Christianity and then just time, it's a real mess of trying to keep pagan writings still around. Christianity and time, the most difficult things to fight against.
The gods in like most of the myths just seem to, treat humans kind of like toys and just, mess around with them and then get bored and chuck them in the bin. But Dionysus never does that, like we were talking about, how he supposedly looked after those women that went into the enemy town, but also even like going back to his relationship with his mother, like he supposedly went down to the underworld to get her out so she could like become a god and live up with him. So even with his mortal mother, who he never really met because she died before she even gave birth to him, but he still kind of cherishes her and makes sure that actually she's going to have, even though she had the unfortunate luck of meeting Zeus, he was going to make sure that she turned out okay.
Yeah. And it's very different from the other example we have of Zeus sort of, I don't want to say giving birth, because I think it's just like that weird patriarchal thing of needing these important gods to be from the man who, but Athena doesn't really ever take into account her mother. Like Metis is pretty forgotten. Meanwhile, Semele is not. And that's, I think, more indicative of Dionysus as a character, versus Athena is problematic in so many ways because of the patriarchy, not because necessarily she would have automatically been problematic, but just to have Dionysus be sort of, it's like he's not a product of the patriarchy in the way that all the other gods are. He's just kind of this completely separate figure in some seemingly impossible way, where how that happened is sort of baffling.
Yeah, I know, I completely agree. It's kind of like if you imagine a god that, you know, someone now who's like a feminist and, you know, trying to be trans inclusive and inclusive of all sexualities, if they had to invent their own god, that would be Dionysus. Like
Yeah.
somehow he just completely bypasses all of the like toxic patriarchy that we have in ancient Greece and Rome, and he just transcends all of these boundaries. And yeah, and people even in, you know, the ancient world kind of thought, oh, he's not like everybody else. So, you know, they call him the false male at times in some cults because he's not they're like, oh, he's not real, you know, he's not quite right. But I think it's really interesting how he, you know, even 100 years ago, the things that we are seeing in the mythologies, the things that we are seeing him say and do, would have been thought of as really not suited for a man to do. And now suddenly we're in this position where it seems like he's more relevant than ever, really. Like, and I think that's one of the things that I really, really love about him, is this kind of, I consider it a massive relevance to the modern day. Although obviously, as we were talking about earlier, you can't like draw these parallels, but still, yeah, I just think it's really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think as much as it is impossible to draw the parallels to how we see things now, I mean, there's still so much about the mythology that is important and relevant, especially when you can look at it critically, which is obviously my favorite thing to do. Look at these stories critically in terms of who gave us the content, not necessarily who came up with it, but who passed it down to us.
Yeah.
But having that one character who doesn't fit that mold, who sort of is separate from all of the bullshit associated with the ancient world and the things that we have from it, is fascinating. It's just sort of an added bonus to everything. I mean, it's just sort of, it kind of is reassuring in a way where you're like, all right, you know, things were, you know, as much as like a lot of it seemed like it was pretty bad for people who weren't men, or specifically like Greek men, that it's reassuring that there was this place, it seems, for other people, for women and for people who weren't male Greeks specifically. And
but yes, we did start this podcast about Sappho. As I'm sure they told you, it really originated because I heard about it on another podcast, and I was like, who is Sappho? And like, you know, it took me a long time to come into my identity. I'm bisexual, and I think like a lot of bisexual women especially, I had like slept with women, but I was like, I'm straight. All straight people do this. And so it's really hard to accept your identity, I think, in queer spaces, having that very different experience, like I guess externally always looking quite heterosexual and whatnot. And it's been really and just really great trying to create an inclusive podcast that does include bisexual people, because Sappho's name is often used to exclude them from, you know, lesbian identity and sapphic identity. So it's been a journey, but I'm not a historian.
Neither am I. But that have a BA from 10 years ago, so don't worry. But that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. Like, Sappho is so often ascribed either, like, it's like either she's straight or she's, you know, lesbian exclusively. It doesn't, I mean, there's not a lot of talk about her in general, I think, in sort of like more, like less academic, less like nerd filled spaces, and there should be. But in general, yeah, you think about like the word sapphic or lesbian for lesbos, all of that tends to exclude bisexual people. But she did write about men and women, right?
Yeah, she did. And there's debate about that, like whether or not she was speaking as a character. I mean, as you know, her husband is Kirkolos of Andros, which is Dick from Man Island, but which is still my favorite joke about all of it. But the funniest thing for me has been like, you know, I've been spending a lot of time on twitter.com, and my favorite thing is when people like very firmly assert her identity. So they're like, Sappho was a bi-lesbian, Sappho was a lesbian, Sappho was bisexual. And there was, I think, someone from Ireland the other day, and I don't know who it was, and it was the most perfect response. And they were like, she told you that, like, it's just like, exactly. Like, they didn't even use these words. Like, lesbian is from Sappho.
Yeah, like, yeah, as if it existed. She's literally a woman from Lesbos. That's where we get the word. She is a lesbian, but then every single person from Lesbos is and was a lesbian.
Yes. And not in the way that we talk about it today.
Exactly.
Which apparently the Isle of Lesbos tried to sue over this, over the use of the word lesbian.
Who would
I don't know.
who would they sue?
The world? Like, we're so mad.
The whole world? I'm going to sue the English language.
So, I mean, it's just been a really interesting thing for me. And I've always found this, and I think maybe like as a virtue of aging, you get a little less certain. And I found this so interesting in sort of like the pandemic with TikTok, and you see these 18-year-olds who are like, this is facts and this is how it is. And I'm just like, you don't know. Like, we don't know. We just did a whole podcast on Sappho. And all I will say, like, with, I guess, a level of confidence, is that she was a woman who loved other women. And that's all I'm going to say.
And she wrote poetry.
We can agree
she
on
wrote
that.
Poetry.
But yes,
Yep.
We've had people email us and message us and being like, I'm bisexual, but I really love your podcast. But one of the hosts is bisexual. This is also your history. So it's been a great thing to be a part of. I still feel like not queer enough.
Interesting. I mean, like, obviously this is different, but I feel this so deeply in just like the way I position myself and this podcast in the world of classics. Like, I always feel like I am not academic or enough or not like classic centric enough. And like, it has nothing to do with my, you know, personal identity. So I don't want to connect it in that way. But I definitely like identify with the idea of just like not being enough in something that you are enough in.
Yes.
Like, you objectively are enough. You are bisexual enough, and I am classics enough.
How much pussy do I have to eat? Is always my question. Like, what's the number? Just tell me the number.
But Hippolytus is really, really interesting as a character because, you know, the thing that sets that whole plot off is that he comes in and he sees two statues. He sees Artemis, his great goddessly love, you know, the object of his devotion, who is virginal, who is sexless, who embodies this purity of hunting, staying out in the woods, doing natural physical things of avoiding society. And Hippolytus is like, yeah, I am all about, and it's not like he's effeminate at all. Not at all. He embodies Greek young warrior manhood, right? He is super strong. He's super tough. He's good looking. He's a great hunter. He's a good son, even though, you know, his dad is a shit and his mom is dead. But
because his dad is a shit.
Right. And like, he doesn't even like, he's like, you know, I can respect whoever he marries next. That's, you know, it's not my problem. And I don't even really care if I inherit. Like, that's not his deal. He's just like, I just want to be me and be free of this nonsense. But his mistake is with the second statue of Aphrodite. He is so incensed with Aphrodite, with the idea of sex, that he rejects her. He spits on her. He curses her. And you can't actively reject a god. That's never a good idea. Like,
No.
if you don't like them, you
Be
just
quiet.
just don't say anything.
Yeah.
Like, that's your best bet. And like, if you have to say something, be like, I respect what you do over there. Like,
Stay away
that's
from
fine.
me, but over there.
Fine.
Yeah.
Like, if you gotta placate the Furies, you placate the Furies. You don't want their attention. Do not piss off Aphrodite. But of course, that's exactly what he does. He pisses off Aphrodite. And even like in the moment, like his attendants are like, maybe you want to walk that back? And he's like, no. Aphrodite represents the most disgusting aspects of humanity. And, I can understand how somebody who's raised by Theseus, or, well, not raised by Theseus, might feel that way, right? He's a male son of an Amazon, and the world's biggest dickhead. Of course he feels that way, but even if he didn't feel that way, like for emotional reasons, the fact that he is repulsed by the idea of sex, that he never wants sex for himself as a young man, and like we were saying, this is a guy who was likely just flooded with hormones all the time, but he doesn't want sex. He doesn't want men. He doesn't want women. He doesn't want non-binary people. He is just happy being by himself, being on the hunt. And that is a frankly very asexual position. Not all aces are sex repulsed, but some are. And I think it's actually a fairly, outside of aces, a fairly uncommon thing to be repulsed by sex, to have that strong a reaction to it. And so, I was talking this through with a friend of mine who's also working on sort of the Roman angle of asexuality in myth. And like, I don't think I would ever even have thought to apply my identity to mythology in this way if it hadn't been for those conversations. And she brought up, at the end of that play, Hippolytus is killed by a bull. Right? Like rushing out of the sea, like kind of non sequitur. Like, what is a bull doing in the sea? What is this about? And a lot of people will argue back and forth about what the bull represents. I've heard one very respected classicist make an argument that it's his repressed sexual nature coming up out of the sea to claim him. Right. So there's
I made a face. That's a non-audio thing that got that reaction there.
Yeah, so it's a little bit far-fetched, right? But it's also far-fetched that a bull comes out of the sea and kills him. So like, what is it doing there? And it would, at least you could kind of follow the steps if it were his repressed sexual desire, but there's absolutely no indication that it is, right? Like, there's just not much there, unless you look forward to Ovid, who does some playing with that and talks about the swell of the waves and all of those sorts of innuendo. But like, even if that is, Hippolytus shows no sexual desire. None at all. And this actually reminds me of one of the things that people in modern day get wrong about aces. Having no sexual attraction to other people doesn't necessarily mean that your body never wants sexual action. Sometimes aces have libido. Sometimes aces masturbate. Some aces even have sex, and like, they're not necessarily just attracted to the person they're having sex with, but maybe they love them, or maybe it's sort of a fleeting interaction, or maybe it's more about friendship for them. Like, there are a lot of ways in which sex can still come into an ace's being. And so maybe as a teenager with raging hormones, these are his sexual feelings that have absolutely nowhere to go and no part in his day-to-day life. that seems plausible. But why a bull? Why the sea? I still have not quite figured that one out.
Yeah, because like you said, he completely doesn't fit into any of the boxes that we have that other gods kind of do. Even we have like some gods who, you know, don't really fit. Like Athena doesn't really act like other female goddesses, but she's still, there's never any doubt that she is a goddess, you know. Whereas Dionysus, it's just he consistently there are three kind of main areas when I was doing my research that it came up that he has this kind of queer nature, which is firstly in the way that, like, his gender presentation, in the way that he appears. And that's something that consistently throughout mythology you see gods and goddesses like disguising themselves. And so it's made very clear that how a god looks is determined by the god at that particular time. You know, they can choose how they are appearing.
Swans are not a swan.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a really sexy bull. Yeah, and the playwright Euripides like makes that really clear in his play The Bacchae, which is about Dionysus and his followers. And he says he has Dionysus say that he appears how he wishes to appear when he's questioned about his identity. And so it's made really, really clear that, you know, this kind of androgynous, effeminate way that Dionysus is normally portrayed as appearing is a deliberate choice. You know, that's how he has chosen to present himself. Yeah, and then alongside kind of his like physical appearance, you also get a real emphasis on the clothing that he uses, which is also like really not typical male clothing at all. Like he, in one text by a guy called Nonus, who's talking about basically how effeminate Dionysus is, and he says Dionysus always appears like a young girl, and he wears saffron robes and puts a veil over his hair, and he will put like a purple girdle over his hips like he's a maiden. And it's really just like emphasizing one thing after another, all of this long list that Dionysus kind of adopts these what we kind of perceive to be female clothing.
That's interesting too, because I don't think a lot of the gods necessarily get descriptions like that. I think Athena's an exception. You kind of always know how Athena's dressed, but definitely not all of them get these kind of descriptions of what they look like and how they present as when they're in sort of a human form.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting, that people would find the need to sort of really emphasize Dionysus.
Yeah, exactly. And it's literally, like you said, it's not a common thing for people to make note of. You know, that isn't normally the most interesting thing about the god, but it's constantly referred to with Dionysus. And even his mannerisms revolve around the fact that he is dressed like a woman, or, you know, so they think. So, like, another playwright, Aristophanes, makes a mention of Dionysus constantly adjusting his dress, which was seen to be a very, very like female thing to do. And even like the use of having veiled hair, that is typically a very female thing. You know, in classical Greece, there's still a bit of debate over, I don't want to get into this very contentious subject in academia, but there is definitely some evidence that women always covered their hair in classical Greece. Definitely Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones would argue that. But regardless, it is a very female thing to do. And even in artistic depictions, you have this idea of the heroic nude, which is like all of these amazing Greek gods that are, you know, buff and huge and more muscles than sense. They always appear naked. But then we have all these beautiful images of Dionysus, like on vases, and even in some cases and statues, and he's always clothed until like the middle of the 4th century. He always really appears clothed.
I know, right? And you know, I think you can get some really interesting stuff out of how Euripides is portrayed in other things, like in Aristophanes. I don't know if you've read the Thesmophoria Zeusi.
No, I need to. Yeah.
It's a wild ride. So for the listeners, the Thesmophoria Zeusi, Thesmophoria was a women's festival in Athens where all of the men were shut out. It was sacrilege for them to come out during this festival, and the only men allowed to actually be present were foreigners. Foreign men were allowed, but Athenian men were not. And Greek men in general were not. But the relevant thing in the Thesmophoria Zeusi, which is an Aristophanes, it's a comedy about this festival and about guys trying to sneak into the festival. They actually go to Euripides for tips on how to pass as a woman. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Like,
and how does, because I know that there's a lot of like, I don't know if I think it is from Aristophanes where we get this idea that Euripides was like a misogynist.
Yeah, it is.
And so is that kind of where it's coming from? And he does he give a bad answer? Like what's the story there?
So as far as I can tell, and you may get different opinions on this, but as far as I can tell, Euripides was either a straight trans woman or very, very gay. Like, exclusively loved men. And was not shy about the fact that he was okay being the bottom, which is not okay
Also, yeah,
in
not
Greek and Roman culture. Like, that's what makes you effeminate, not loving another man. So he seems to be a woman hater in the sense that he doesn't want to have sex with them, and traditionalists find his portrayal of them ugly somehow.
Because they're real.
Right, exactly. Like, I read Euripides women and I'm like, these are relatable women.
Yeah, they have agency. They're real people. They're like complex and yeah. Oh my god. Yeah.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
I'm obsessed with him.
So I read that sort of portrayal by Euripides as him being able to step back from the imposed gender roles for whichever reason and say, okay, these women are people. They have their reasons, and they're all going to be reasonable reasons, even if the actions they do are bad. And that's why someone like Phaedra is so compelling.
And Medea.
Yeah, that's why Medea is... Even though he invented her killing her children, that wasn't part of the story before.
I always forget that because it just feels so right.
Right.
But yeah, that's the thing, right? He gives us this horrific woman, but she is so compelling and complex and interesting, and she's just so many things that make me love her in a way where I'm like, well, I recognize that you are objectively bad. You're doing not great things, but you're so interesting and you're so well written in that play that I just want to be your best friend in this way where I'm like, I probably wouldn't in the end, you know, like, but you know, like I just love her. But
right.
yeah.
And so I think that's why he writes Phoenici the way he does, where our principal viewpoint characters are not Eteocles and Polynices, but Jocasta and Antigone.
Yeah.
Right? So when he sees, because Aeschylus was writing much earlier, I mean not much earlier, but earlier, when he sees the introduction of Parthenopaeus with this warrior woman of the Sphinx killing a Theban, he takes that and says, a warrior woman killing a symbol of masculinity for Parthenopaeus is not going to be abstract like that. It's his mother. And it's a positive.
It's also not going to be, it's also not going to be like Boeotian.
Right.
He's not coming from there. Yeah, he's against Thebes. So it's not going to be the Sphinx that was of Thebes.
I mean, like, in some sense that makes sense. like, you know, if he wants to be intimidating, sure.
True, yeah.
But like, for Euripides writing that as Parthenopaeus' symbol, I think it really makes sense if he's thinking about gender relationships, if he's thinking about, you know, what is a symbol of badassery to Parthenopaeus? His mother, his badass ace Artemis loving mother. And the most, you know, widely recognized badass thing she ever did. And, you know, between that and sort of the very compelling asexuality of Hippolytus, right, where he, you know, Phaedra is written lovingly, but Hippolytus really, he feels real too. His rejection of her feels just as real as her longing for him. And it doesn't feel like it's about her. Right? Like the way it's written, you know, he does sort of insult her, but the main thing that we've already had set up in that play is that he is anti-Aphrodite in everything she stands for. And so that's really what's going on with him in that scene, is like, he is disgusted, not necessarily by her, but by what she's suggesting. And not because of some, you know, concern for his asshole of a father either.
Yeah, oh God, no. Who would care about that? It's not like Theseus ever did anything for him. Lord.
There's a really valuable and cool and valid trend of queering the classics. And yes, good, fantastic, that should happen. But specifically with a play like Bacchae, I think that's a wonderful counterpoint to queering, is to not have to queer. It is queer. It is already there.
Yeah.
It is not somebody kind of putting an interpretation on it. It's not, we're doing The Tempest, but we're doing it in space.
Yeah.
It's not, you know, we're doing this as a musical. We're doing this in the Wild West. It's not these kind of transplantations. It's, no, we're listening to the story.
Yeah. I mean, all you had to do earlier was just like, tell me the plots of it. And I was like, oh yeah, I get completely all of the levels of, I mean, I've always seen Dionysus as, if not like explicitly like non-binary, then just like, I mean, I don't know that there is a difference necessarily in like fluidity in general, but you know, like at least exploring genders. And so to even just like go through and just have you say it as like, okay, but you know, what if everything that does happen in the play happened more because of gender than it did an angry god? And it's like, that's not changing anything about the play. That's just like using different words to describe it than have been traditionally used by like cisgendered straight people, you know? And it's just like, you're not, it is exactly the same play. It's just, you're looking at it from a viewpoint of diversity and gender nonconformity and all of these things. That's just like, it's just the way your eyes see it. It's not actually like, queering anything. It's just reading it.
And it gets especially interesting and complicated and messy when you're talking about theater, because there's a lot more people involved in the creation of theater than there is in the creation of a translation. In the creation of a translation, there is the original author of the text and you. And in theater, you have bodies on stage. And something that I want to harp on, and kind of the soapbox and the hill that I will die on, is we need, whatever that is, you know, people who are producing theater, and I will say specifically with Bacchae and specifically with the character of Dionysus, could benefit from casting bodies and people that are not cis white men. And putting bodies on stage in the role of this complicated and morally questionable, but charming and compelling and powerful and emotionally complex and, you know, intelligent and funny, but also really in pain, and this otherworldly supernatural figure. who is tremendously powerful, having that experience put in the body of someone who is from a marginalized group. And someone who also doesn't, I'm very much in favor of Dionysus being played by non-binary or gender non-conforming actors who do not fit traditional definitions of androgyny. Because there is this overwhelming trend to only view androgyny through a thin, white, masculine-leaning lens. And people with bodies that have breasts, or people with bodies that have hips, or people with fat bodies are often find it more difficult to be perceived as androgynous. Or as, as gender nonconforming, or as kind of blurring a binary when there are features that society is unwilling to read as anything other than them. Which is not to exclude people, like kind of people who lean more masculine in even within the non-binary community and gender presentation, but there is the kind of archetypal image of androgyny is that kind of David Bowie.
Yeah, absolutely. Ugh, you magnificent nerds. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. These past conversations are some of my just all-time favorites. I just learned so much and got such incredible insights into these mythological characters and even the very historical Sappho. Ugh, I couldn't be more grateful to all of these past guests and, of course, to Grace and Michaela for helping to put this episode together. If you're interested in listening to the full conversation episodes that are featured here, or the all other episodes that I've covered covering LGBTQIA characters and stories, you can find a link in this episode's description to a new page on my website that features all of those episodes. There's also a Spotify playlist linked. Head over there to find all of the stories of these incredible ancient characters and people, these examples of ancient representation that is more important than ever. Visit mythsbaby.com/LGBTQIA. Always remember, queerness, gayness, trans people, non-binary people. None of this is new. None of this should be controversial. People should just be able to live their true lives, be their true selves, and fuck everyone who says otherwise. It's more important than ever that we remember this and we stand up for our trans, non-binary, and gay friends. Everybody. God, just let them be human. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith, as always, is the Hermes to my Olympians and handles so many podcast-related things, particularly in this episode and last week's, and generally while I am away traveling. In the case of this episode, she's helped put it all together for me like a true goddess. My intern, Grace Roby, has been incredible help on so many things, particularly today's episode. I am recording this bit before we've done it, but I just know it's going to turn out great. Grace is working with Michaela to pull together these clips and stories from past episodes to just pull it all together for all you wonderful listeners. Stephanie Foley works to transcribe this podcast for YouTube captions and accessibility. She is indispensable. The podcast is hosted and monetized by Acast. I am so fucking fortunate to have all of you incredible listeners. I'm truly so grateful. I say that all the time, but it's always true. Thank you all for helping me make this my job and helping me get big enough to hire Michaela and be busy enough to take on Grace as an intern. It means the whole fucking world. You're all the best. They're the best. Everyone is the best. I am Liv, and I love this shit.